Are you interested in making homemade sourdough bread, but you are tired of the lengthy and complicated recipes? I have tried almost every sourdough recipe out there, and I finally figured out the secret to making quick, no-knead sourdough bread that does not require days and days of preparation. Come with me and I'm going to show you how. This sourdough bread recipe requires a fed sourdough starter. So the night before I want to bake my bread, I pull my starter out of the fridge so that I can get some of her discarded and get her fed and ready to use. You want to discard roughly half of your starter depending on how much you do want to use the next day. I never measure this, I just eyeball it and it always turns out for me. I use regular unbleached all-purpose flour to feed my starter, along with non-chlorinated filtered water. I use roughly half and half of flour and water. If you want to know how to make your own sourdough starter, maintain it so it's easy to use, leave a comment down below and I'll make an in-depth video on how to create and maintain your own sourdough starter. Once you get your flour and water in, you want to mix very, very well to make sure that it is all incorporated with that original starter to get everything mixed up and make sure there's no flour clumps anywhere. Try to keep my jar as clean as I can. She's still a little bit messy. But once it's all mixed up, I cover it with a tea towel and I like to put a rubber band on it to keep any critters out and let it ferment overnight. The next morning you will see she has risen great. She has lots of good bubbles in there. Seeing those bubbles is a good indicator that your starter is ready to use. I've tried so many sourdough recipes and I tried so many with measuring cups and measuring spoons. Use a measuring scale, measure in grams. That's how it works. That's how I've gotten it to work. You want to use 360 grams of filtered non-chlorinated water. Make sure to tear it out so you don't have to do a lot of math. Then I use 100 grams of fed sourdough starter. When the sourdough starter floats on the water like that, that's another way you can know that it is fed and hydrated and ready to use. Then I mix the starter into the water so it's all incorporated when I add my dry ingredients and I don't even have to use my hands at all for this first initial dough mixing step. I use 200 grams of all-purpose flour and I like to sprinkle it all around roughly with the other dry ingredients. That way I can mix the dry ingredients somewhat on top before I mix it into the water and starter mixture. I use 300 grams of hard white wheat flour. You can use any type of wheat flour, any type of bread flour works here. Hard white wheat is just what I currently have and it's working great for me. The last and final ingredient is just 10 grams of salt. You make sure that you use non-iodized salt also. Then you roughly mix in the dry ingredients on top, get them incorporated into the wet water sourdough mixture, and it's gonna be a shaggy, sticky dough, but that's all you gotta do. Mix it till it's incorporated, throw your tea towel over it, and let it sit anywhere from 1 to 3 hours. I know that's a lot different than other recipes, but I've done this next step at 1 hour, I've done it at 3, and my bread still turns out every time for me. This is going to be the first step of stretching and folding, and it is literally just grabbing a corner, pulling it up, stretching it over onto itself. I do this about 5 times, just until I get the shape more of an actual dough ball instead of just that shaggy mess that we first started out with. You're going to do 3 sets of these stretch and folds, and the time in between all of them is anywhere from 1 to 3 hours. This is our second set of stretch and fold, and you can already see it's risen and is looking much more like dough instead of the super, super shaggy dough. It's looking more normal. With the 1 to 3 hours of proofing time, it also doesn't have to be the same amount each time. I have done the first one at 1 hour, and the next one I've waited 3 hours. I've done them all 1 hour. It's really just kind of depends on your schedule and what you have going on for the day and when you're able to get to it. You always want to make sure it's covered to keep anything out of it. And then, as you can see, before our third stretch and fold here that we're going to do, the last one, it already has lots of bubbles. You can sort of see them in the dough. You want to be somewhat careful. I was a little rougher than I should have been probably. To make sure not to pop a lot of those bubbles, those are what's going to create the crumb in your sourdough bread. So you want to keep as many of those bubbles intact as you can. And continue to stretch and fold. The last one I like to pick up because she's getting much more regular dough-like here. Pick up and fold on top of herself. So after that third one, after another anywhere from 1 to 3 hours, you can see all the bubbles in it. Your dough is just about ready to be baked. Pretty close. I like to use a glass baking dish. You can use whatever type of loaf pan. The glass is what I like, and I learned the hard way that you definitely want to use enough butter to grease it, or else it's really hard to get out. I cover the bottom in cornmeal as well. A decently thick layer of it. It helps with the taste and the flavor and helps it to come out of the loaf pan easier. I lightly sprinkle my work surface with flour and turn the dough out onto it. You want to be fairly gentle to keep those bubbles as nice as you can. And then I pull and stretch it into as much of a square shape as I can. Fold it on top of each other hot dog ways, hot dog length, and then fold the ends on top of each other also to pulling it gently and trying to create a little bit of tension to make that crust nice and taut and crisp. Then I just gently roll it onto the counter to create a little bit more tension to let it fold under itself into a rough loaf shape until it will fit into my loaf pan. I'm not a professional, but this is how making sourdough bread has worked for me every time. You want to preheat your oven to 350 degrees and wait anywhere from 30 to 60 minutes before you stick it in to bake. Oh, it hasn't risen a whole lot, but you'll see baking it always rises a lot more in the oven. So bake it for 45 minutes at 350 degrees. You don't have to cover it, you don't have to spray it with water, and it comes out great every time. I don't even score the bread. It usually rips and has a little bit of an ear on me. You can score it if you wanted to. Being a busy mom, sometimes I just don't even have time for it, but it's still a beautiful, delicious loaf of sourdough bread. You can cut into it right away, but it will turn gummy on you. So I like to set mine on a cooling rack and let it cool overnight. And then the next morning we will slice into it. And this day we were using it for grilled cheese sandwiches. As you can see, it has a nice crispy crust. It has that open crumb with the holes on it. She is squishy and soft and just that delicious sourdough flavor. If you are interested in any more traditional whole food recipes or preserving methods, check out one of these videos next. Thank you so much for watching, and remember to live free and find your purpose.